In this video, I'm going to share with you 10 points to help you to decide whether you go with a composite material or wood material for your next deck or rebuild. And point number one is composites mean less maintenance. Now that kind of goes without saying, of course. Why would anyone use composites otherwise? But there is some things to understand here. Composites will free you from the need to finish and refinish the wood. And that's a big savings, because if you want to keep your deck looking refined and like new, well, that's going to take a lot of work. You're going to have to refinish that deck, depending on what you use. If it's made of wood, every year, every 2 years, certainly every 3 or 4 years. And like I said, that can be a ton of work. So composites save you from that. But they don't save you from the need to maintain the deck and keep it clean. And in some cases where your deck might be in a shaded location and there's you live in a moist climate, things can grow on composites. Not very quickly, and it's nowhere near the level of work required to refinish that deck, but you need to be aware of that. Maintenance will be reduced, but it won't absolutely be eliminated. Now, before I go on to point number two, I just want to show you a bit of composite material. This is from a company called Trex. They invented composites several decades ago, and they're currently one of the leading brands. I like them a lot. I use Trex in some of my own work. And if you look closely here, you'll see that this material is a blend of recycled plastic, and often it comes from shopping bags, I'm told, and wood fibers. The lighter sections you see here, they're all chunks of wood, usually from ground up shipping pallets. And the combination makes for a material that works a lot like wood, just like wood in fact. You can use the same tools. It carves, cuts kind of like wood, and because of the wood and plastic combination, I have never seen Trex melt during a cut from friction from the blade or something. It really does just work kind of like wood. It doesn't have a grain to it, so you can work it the same way lengthwise and crosswise. But this is what composite is. I'll be getting into more detail later about the different families and categories of composite, but that's the composite deal in a nutshell. Point number two, wood looks better, but. Now what do I mean by the but? Well, in my opinion, a properly finished deck treated to a high level of care looks better than any composite I've seen on the market. The problem is that wood doesn't stay looking like that. In fact, a year after a pristine finish applied to a wood deck, things are going to start to look a little bit tired. After 2 years, 3 years, you're probably going to have to refinish again if you want to maintain that high level of refined appearance. A composite deck can look beautiful, very beautiful in fact, not quite to the level of wood, but it will stay that way. Now, composites do slowly fade in time. Some colors get a little less vibrant and things, but you're never going to have any peeling. You're never going to have any cracking. It's a much more consistent experience. Now, I don't know about you, I have lived with wooden decks that I care about a lot and that I've invested a lot in finishing, and I'm always very pleased. Wow, that looks great. But after it starts to look ratty, even at the beginning, it just sort of bugs me. Oh, I got to get to finishing that deck. Oh, when am I going to find time for that? Oh, the weather's no good for refinishing today. It kind of hangs on you and weighs on you, or at least it does me a bit. So when it comes to composites, it frees you from that. You don't have quite the beauty of a furniture grade finish on the wood, but it's pretty good, pretty close, and you don't have that nagging feeling, oh, come spring, I got to finish that thing again. Point number three, composites cost more, sort of. Now, what do I mean by sort of? Well, if you're comparing, say, Trex or any of the other brands that have come out, you're comparing that to, say, the least expensive wood option, that would be pressure-treated wood of some kind, then composites are going to be considerably more expensive. But what you might not realize is that when you're buying a composite, you're essentially paying for all of the finishing materials and all of the finishing labor that you'd otherwise have to put into that wood deck to keep it looking good. So it's like you're paying ahead, so to speak, and then you don't have to worry about it. So in that sense, composites are not as costly as you'd otherwise think, because you're buying ahead, you're getting out of all that dread and the labor of having to refinish the thing. I should mention, though, that wood decks do not need to be finished for structural reasons. I often get emails from subscribers and they say, well, what should I put on my deck to make it last as long as possible? Well, my answer is you don't have to put anything on it, because no finish preserves the lifespan of wood. It does not prevent the wood from rotting. It can prevent the wood from forming surface checks and cracks, but those are not structurally significant. So once again, it comes down to an aesthetic thing. And the main thing that determines how long a deck lasts is how it's designed. And by that I mean, is the design such that the wood-to-wood contact surfaces are as small as possible? Because the thing that really rots a deck is when you have lots of wood tight to each other, maybe for a beam or even deck boards resting on top of the joists. It holds the moisture there between rains. It attracts insects. They leave their droppings behind. The droppings in the cracks that are moist also have nutrients in it. So that's the perfect situation to encourage rotting and mold growth and all kinds of things. So finishing of a wood deck is optional. And for some people who have a casual home or a laid-back country place, you're not going to be enduring any more hardship building out of wood than composite. But if you want a higher appearance quotient, then composites are probably something that you should look at. And also too, just before I forget, composites may be costly, but they're no more costly than some of the fancy tropical hardwoods that are being sold for deck use. Clear Western red cedar, very expensive stuff. They're going to last well, but this is where most people are surprised. Those high-end woods, the tropical hardwoods and things that are just as costly as composite and maybe even more costly, they're going to go gray in time unless they're finished. They're going to look good and natural for a while, but eventually all wood goes gray when it's out in the sun and the moisture. So it's not as expensive as you might think to go with composites. Point number 4, different kinds of composites. So what do I mean by different kinds? Well, like I said before, once upon a time, the only composite was this 50-50 blend of recycled plastic and wood. And that's still on the market, and it's still my favorite. And why? Because you can work it the same way as wood, including routing the edges of boards to make them look more attractive. That works wonders, whether you're working with wood or composite. But you can only do it with solid composite. And in order to reduce cost and weight, because a composite board is pretty heavy, it's heavier, much heavier than a regular all-wood board. To reduce cost and reduce weight, there are composites that are hollow. They kind of look like a 2x6 from the outside, but they're not solid. They're hollow, and I don't really like those as much as the solid stuff, because you've got to put on end caps or some kind of hardware-y kind of thing to hide the hollow ends of those boards. And it just looks a little more mechanical, a little less organic, a little bit less like wood. Now there are also composites. I'll call them composites for now, because it's not really the correct term, because this next material I'm going to tell you about is not composed of different things. It's just solid plastic. Starting to see more and more of those things. There's also mineral-based composite type materials. So the marketplace is diversifying. Companies are trying to find better options that cost less. They want to bring the price down. But you do need to decide what kind of composite you're going to go with. And you should spend some time examining that. If cost is very important to you, then some kind of hollow stuff is going to be your best bet. And that's essentially what it comes down to. You'll want to spend some time online visiting different samples in stores, and then go for the look that you want. But my personal preference, solid 50-50 wood plastic stuff. Point number 5, retrofitting older decks. Now, I didn't get on the composite bandwagon right away when it was possible. I built my own house. I put a wraparound veranda around all 4 sides. There's something like 150 feet of covered veranda around my place, so that's a lot. And I made the deck floor out of eastern white cedar, which is what it's available locally to me where I live. It looked great. I was on my hands and knees sanding and staining and sealing, and it really did look like a piece of furniture. And the image you see here is what I'm talking about. This is part of my deck, and doesn't it look great? It sure does look great. It still continued to look great for about a year. After 2 years, there's starting to be some deterioration in the finish, especially around knots or around corners of boards where the finish layer would be kind of thin. And so I did a refinishing. Big job again. When that started to look a little ratty, I thought, gee, I mean, I'm going to be spending, I don't know, it seemed like a couple of months on my hands and knees every few years. It just seemed like too much. The deck looked great when it was new, but so I opted to take off all of these white cedar deck boards. Perfect condition, nothing wrong with them at all. I gave them to a friend of mine who was building a deck, and he wasn't intending to finish it at all, so it worked out perfectly for him. And then I replaced those deck boards with Trex. And it's looked pretty much the same for 23 years now, something like that. It's been on there a long time. All I do is clean it. Pressure wash it once or twice a year, give it a little scrub. I'm good to go. And that's something that you might want to consider, that strategy. Because if the structure of your deck, the posts and beams and floor joists, are in good shape, and you're just sick and tired of refinishing those deck boards, you can take them off and you can use that frame again and just apply some composite on top, and you'll be living on easy street after that. It is definitely a possibility. Point number 6, beware of composite expansion. Now, most composites have some fairly high plastic component in them. And one thing about plastics is that they expand and contract a lot more than wood with changes in temperature. So it's very important that when you're laying your composites, you'll want to refer to the manufacturer's recommendations, but in most cases, you're going to want to leave a substantial gap at the end of one board and the beginning of the other. Now, what constitutes substantial in this case? Well, it kind of depends on the temperature that it is when you're installing this stuff. Like for instance, right now, Canadian winter, pretty cold. If I was doing a deck now, I don't think anybody builds decks in this weather, but if I was, I would have to leave an exceptionally large amount of space between the ends of the boards because I know those boards are going to swell and they're going to get bigger when it warms up. So how much bigger? Well, it all depends on the length of board you're talking about, but in my experience, if you've got, say, a 10-foot piece of solid composite like this, and you're going from a cool night in summer, you know, just a normal sort of summertime temperature where it maybe is around room temperature or even a little bit higher, you go from there to full blast sun, landing on the deck with that deck hot enough that you might not even be able to touch it necessarily, depending on where you live, to go from short to long in that case over a 10-foot length, you're looking at least 1/8 of an inch of expansion and probably a little bit more. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because if you install your deck boards together too tightly, end to end, they're going to expand and they're not going to take no for an answer. I mean, those boards are going to do whatever they need to do to expand, and that might mean buckling, just doing some nasty stuff like that. You're trying to fit too big of a board into too small of a space now that it's expanded, and that's going to be a problem. So be sure to understand and follow manufacturer's recommendations for the end gap that you need. And this does bring me to one other point. If you've got an 1.5 inch thick joist, which is standard, and you have the one deck board resting on one side of the board and another deck board resting on the other side of that joist, and you've got a gap in between, your board isn't actually resting on a whole lot of joist anymore. And don't forget, you've also got to drive some sort of a fastener in, and I'll be talking more about this later. You got to drive some sort of a fastener in to somewhat less than half of a joist thickness. It gets pretty tricky. So what I do is wherever I know that deck board ends are going to land, I put in a double joist. So one right next to the other with a 1 inch space in between. Now that might seem like a lot of space between the joists, but what that allows you to do is to have the deck board resting on the joist fully. You've got enough room for a space, and then the other deck board is fully supported, and now your fasteners don't need to be anywhere near the end of the deck boards. You not only have better deck board installation, but now you've got a situation where water that would normally go down and contact the floor joist between the ends of the deck boards, now it can flow right through, and you get better drying, better drainage, and much greater rot resistance. There's no shortage of people who build decks professionally or take on the project, homeowners that take on the project on their own. But in my experience, most decks are built badly in two ways. They might look decent at first, but chances are that if you just go with regular deck construction, there's going to be too much wood-to-wood contact. That's going to promote rot, and your deck's not going to last nearly as long as it could. I've seen brand new decks made with pressure-treated lumber rot to the point of being dangerous in 10 years. But if you follow specific techniques that don't really cost any more, it's just smart design, then you can expect your deck to last 30, 40, 50 years. It should not fail any sooner than that. And that's the kind of stuff that I cover in an online course that I have about building decks. Now that course is part of a VIP do-it-yourself community that I'll be launching soon, along with 14 other courses, a community one-on-one interaction with me to get your questions answered in a timely fashion, and to learn from other people who are kind of just like us. They want to build things, they're curious, they're interested in design, saving some money, making beautiful things, so keep your eye out for that. Point number 7, maintenance still required. Well, as I mentioned before, there's no such thing as completely maintenance-free in this world, and that applies to composite decks too. You're going to have to clean it. Of course, dirt's going to get on it. And as I mentioned, if you're in a shady, moist situation, things could grow on the deck. I find a pressure washer is a good start to cleaning the deck, but I've never found it to be a complete substitute for a little bit of scrubbing as well. So what I use is the kind of wand-style car wash brush where there's a brush on the end and water flows through the handle, and I give the deck a going over that way. If there's something growing on your deck, you might have, like lichen moss, you might have to do a little bit of scrubbing on your hands and knees. The good news is that those growths never happen very quickly. I didn't have any growths whatsoever on the north shaded side of my house deck, for instance, for 5 or 10 years. And then this little green haze started to appear, not very noticeable and pretty easy to remove with some scrubbing. I use an oxygen-based cleaner for that, along with a brush and then a final rinsing off. But there's something that you need to know, especially if you choose composite deck boards that are fairly dark in color. What can happen, what I have seen happen, is that the minerals in the water, and no water from your tap is perfectly mineral free, the minerals from your water can stick around after the water has dried, and those minerals will remain there. You won't notice it for the first year or two, but by 3 or 4 years, your deck's just not looking as vibrantly colored as it was before. You know, what's going on here? I get that question from subscribers a lot too. Well, that's the mineral deposits. And simply washing the deck off is not going to be enough to remove them. So what I like to use is a 50-50 blend of some mineral dissolving product like CLR or something like that, that's designed to dissolve minerals. You slosh it on, you let it sit there for 15 or 20 minutes, and then you wash it off again. And that will restore the color that you lost. But if you really want to be diligent about it, what I do is to go over the deck again quickly with a leaf blower. And that just blows off any excess water before it's had a chance to evaporate. And you will get much less mineral buildup if you follow that procedure. Point number 8, composites and invisible fasteners. Now, if you're not familiar with the way deck boards are anchored, traditionally it was nails. Through the face of it, you'd see a pair of nails every so often. Wherever there was a joist, you'll see a pair of nails for each board. Then the world got into deck screws, and deck screws are a lot better than nails, but they were originally used in the same way. So you'd see all these screw heads everywhere. And there's something about the clean look of composite decking that really makes visible fasteners look extra bad. You're going to spend some good money on a composite, so we want it to look really good. And that's why I strongly recommend invisible fasteners. And by invisible, I mean they're working below the surface, but they hold the deck without any visible fastener holes on the top. There are different ways to do this. The first versions took a lot longer to install than the hidden fasteners we have now. One of the best options I've seen is the approach that's proprietary to Trex. I have no reason to recommend this, except it works really well. You can buy Trex composite boards that have grooves on both edges, and the grooves are meant to accept a clip which fits between two boards, and the clip is anchored by a single screw down into the joist. So that does a couple of things. First of all, it hides the fasteners, very important aesthetically, and these fasteners also allow the deck boards to expand and contract a little bit. They can slide when they get bigger while still being fastened firmly down. So that's another thing. And these invisible fasteners, these particular ones, hold the deck boards away from each other just the right amount so that you got drainage of water and you don't have dirt and things building up between the boards, which is a big promoter of rot. If you get dirt in there and it gets moist, it can cause trouble to the joists as well as wooden deck boards. But Trex isn't the only company that sells hidden deck fastener systems. Of course, there's lots of different options, and I would strongly encourage you to explore that, because your deck will look so much better without a bunch of screw heads showing up everywhere. It's especially true with composites, because certainly when it comes to the composites that are solid, when you drive a deck screw down into them, they're going to cause a berm of plastic to rise up around the screw head a little bit. And you can feel that, and you can see it. Some guys go around with a hammer and kind of tap that plastic down into place. I guess that's a minor improvement, but you can still see where all the screw heads were, and it's quite distracting. So all of this is why I strongly recommend that you get a hidden fastener system, not just for your composite deck, but for any kind of deck. It just makes a huge difference. Point number 9, choosing a look for your composite deck. So what do I mean by choosing a look? Well, it's color choice, it's board installation patterns, and in the case of some composites like Trex and other solids like that, it actually even involves the possibility of bending your Trex boards, your composite boards, so that they have a pattern. They impart a pattern to the overall deck. Composites are quite a bit more flexible than wood. Now that actually reminds me of something. As far as I know, there is no composite substitute for a wood superstructure on a deck. And by superstructure, I mean posts, beams, and joists. Wood really is a marvelous material because it's strong, it's light, in relation to its strength, and it will also resist bending when exposed to ongoing pressure over time. That's not the case with any composites that I'm aware of right now. Now, you can get steel deck frames that will never rot, but if you want to stay with something like wood or composites, you're going to have to still use wood for the superstructure. So that's something to keep in mind. There is another thing too that really surprised me. I like wood, I like real wood, I like authentic materials. And you could certainly argue that composites are a synthetic material. Why would some guy interested in natural materials like you be recommending composites? Well, that's because you have to function in the real world, and you don't want to make your deck your career. But there is something I've noticed, and I shouldn't like this, but I do, and that's composites with fake wood grain actually look a lot better. And by fake wood grain, I don't just mean a visual pattern like of colors. I mean a texture too, a texture that shows kind of like wood grain. Nobody's going to mistake a composite deck for a wood deck, so nobody's going to be fooled by the wood grain thinking, oh wow, that's wonderful Ipe or whatever you're using. But it still just looks nice. It still looks better, looks more organic, more natural than just a smooth surface. So don't be afraid to consider the wood grain textured options as you're shopping, because it makes a huge difference. And look around online, you're going to see some marvelous designs where the flexibility of composite boards has been used to its full advantage. And coupled with different colors of composites too that are making patterns on your deck, it looks pretty good. Point number 10, woodworking with composite scraps. Now, you can't do this with all composites. You certainly couldn't really do it with hollow stuff, but solid stuff, another advantage of it is that you can use it for outdoor woodworking projects. And like I said before, it cuts, routs, sands, just like regular wood, except when you build an outdoor table or some kind of a display frame or a shelf or anything that's going to live outside all the time, then you can use composites for that. And I have. It works great. It's surprising how well it cuts in machines and joins together. Now, you can't glue the pieces together like you would regular wood, because it does have a component of plastic, and plastics can be hard to glue. But you can use screws of all kinds, pocket screws, biscuits with glue can hold joints together quite nicely. And it's just surprising what you can make. I mean, take a look at this display frame that I made out of some scrap composites. Or there's this utility table that's almost 30 years old at our house and still looks as good as the day I made it. So bottom line is that with composites, you're essentially investing in the future by using materials that aren't going to add to your maintenance burden. And if you've been a homeowner for very long, you know that there's plenty of things to maintain around a house, and you probably can't get out of all of them. So helping out with composites can make quite a difference. Now, are you finding this video useful? I hope so, because that's really the reason I make it. And I think if you're interested in decks and home improvements and woodworking and whatnot, like and subscribe. You'll be doing yourself a favor, because you'll always be notified of new material that comes out, and in the sea of content that's in the internet, it can be hard to keep up with things. But if you want to learn together in the future, stick around, become a subscriber, and you won't be sorry.